Welcome to this session, and thank you all very much for attending. My name is John Leonard, and this is my colleague, Ronan, and we're here today to talk about a very interesting segment of the connected device landscape, which is counterfeit and non-standard devices. But first, a brief introduction. We are from Afilias, which is an internet infrastructure company. It provides domain registry backend services and DNS resolutions, a significant proportion of DNS resolutions worldwide. A part of the Afilias portfolio is DeviceAssure, which is a device intelligence platform. It is used worldwide by market-leading companies to provide a wide range of services, and it underpins much of what we're going to talk about today, which is DeviceAssure. So you may not be familiar with DeviceAssure, but you probably benefit from it every day. It is used to support countless services worldwide in the ad tech industry, the analytics industry, and the content serving businesses. With that, I'll hand over to Ronan to take us further.
Thank you, John. So without further ado, we're going to get straight to the point here and give all of you a quick tour of what's actually out on the market today. So we're going to show you some real counterfeit devices and then look at the details of them. So I'm going to flip to the camera, and hopefully it will come up here. There we go. So just to begin with, I'm going to show you a very typical counterfeit device. There are many of these on the market. This is a fake Samsung Galaxy Note 8. Just going to check the focus on that. Okay. So I'm going to start with the box, because the box is what the unwitting consumer first sees. And it's actually quite impressive. So first of all, this is identical to the size and shape of the real Note 8 box. In every detail, there's a picture of the stylus on the side. You see all of the information on the back, just like you'd see on the real device. At the other end of the box, you see the IMEI and the barcode, correct IMEI for the device. And ironically, at the far end, they even have the tamper protection seal, although they put the sticker in such a way that you can't actually break it. But anyway, so that's what the box looks like. At this point, a consumer has no idea that they've just purchased a fake device. This box is perfect. So let's open it up and see what's inside. So at this level, again, the device is essentially perfect. The packaging is perfect. It opens just like you'd expect a real Samsung box to open. And before we look at the actual device, I'm going to show you a little bit of what's in the box, because that's quite impressive too. So first of all, there's the Getting Started guide, just like Samsung include in their boxes. It's in the correct font. It says all the correct things. It's perfect. Put that away. And we have our tray. Underneath, you see the charger. We have the charging cable. And in here, there's the set of headphones. So everything that you'd expect to be in this box is present and correct. So now let's have a look at the device itself. So you can't really see this on the camera, but in the hand, this device feels perfect. The size is correct. The fit and finish is immaculate. The seams are tight. Everything about it feels premium. If we look on the side, you see the Bixby button is even included. On the other side, you've got the power button. At this end, there's nothing to see here. And finally, there's a USB-C charging socket, the stylus that's expected for a Note device, and of course, a headphone jack. So at this point, again, the user, the unwitting consumer, has no idea that they purchased a fake device. It is perfect. So let's turn it on. So the camera isn't doing this justice, but this screen is really, really good. The colors are excellent, and the brightness is really, really good. So let's unlock it. The home screen is exactly as you'd expect on a Samsung Galaxy Note 8. If we swipe up to look at the apps, you can see the Samsung browsers there, the S Planner, the Samsung Health app. So every detail of this has been thought through. And these are the real versions of the apps. They're not fake versions, they're the actual versions of the Samsung app running on a fake device. Let's go back home again. If I press the Bixby button on the side, up comes Bixby, just like you'd expect. So even at a software package level, this device is exactly what you would expect to see had you purchased a real Galaxy Note 8. So the consumer has no idea at this point that the device is fake. So that's a Galaxy Note 8. But the counterfeiters don't, of course, stop with Android devices. They're quite happy to counterfeit anything. So let's have a look at the iOS world. So on the screen, you will see two iPhone 10 boxes. One is real, one is fake. And you can barely tell the difference. The dimensions are absolutely perfect. Even if you purchase an iPhone 10 and you have a box, it's still really difficult to tell the difference. I'll turn them over so you can see the sides. There's the iPhone logo that you'd expect. On the back, you see all the various information that you'd expect to see, including the IMEI, the barcode, and so on. So essentially perfect at this level. So I'm going to put aside the real one and go to the fake device and open it up and see what's inside. So you can't really see this, but the fit and finish of this box is absolutely superb. It has that snug Apple fit that you'd expect. It comes off just like you'd expect. It's perfect. Inside, you have the Design by Apple in California, the Getting Started guide. If I open up that, I've taken out the device, but you can see the headphones and charger are present as you'd expect. The headphones are coiled exactly the same way that you see on the real device. The charger is identical. So the user at this point has no idea. So let's put that away for a second, and we'll have a look at some of the actual devices. So I have the corresponding real and fake iPhone 10s here. One has a screen protector, so it's not doing it justice, but there's nothing to tell these devices apart. Look at the dimensions, absolutely spot on. Power button. On the back, you have the dual camera, as you'd expect, the Apple logo, everything is present. On the bottom, you have the speaker grills, the lightning charging port. Still, you can't tell which is which. So that's an iPhone 10 device, absolutely immaculate, perfect hardware. So I'm going to put them inside and show you another device. So part of what constitutes a smartphone is the software bundle. The hardware, they do a perfect job of the hardware, but to really fool a user, you have to get the software correct as well. So I'm going to look at another fake device. This is a fake iPhone 7. It's physically perfect again. If we now turn it on to have a look at what's inside. So I'm going to unlock it with my fingerprint, and there's the home screen. So that, any of you who use iOS, that'll be quite familiar. But here's the thing. This is running Android. That is not iOS. And even though it's running Android, everything that you'd expect to be there, there's the notification screen and the control panel, the control center, I think they call it, down the bottom. Everything is perfect and functional, exactly like you'd expect. And just to give you all a sense of just how much work has gone into this, I'm going to focus on one little app. This is an app that almost nobody uses, but yeah, look, let's have a look at how they faked it. We're going to have a look at the compass app. So I'm going to click the compass. Up comes the compass, and it does its rotation thing, and it's identical to the real Apple compass app. But here's the thing. This physical device does not have a compass in it. It doesn't have the hardware to support a compass. So think about this. Even though this device doesn't have the hardware to support a compass, and the compass is a really rarely used app, they've nonetheless faked it completely. They've spent the time to fake this completely, even though it's a fairly little used app. So this gives you a sense of the depth of work that's behind this device. This isn't something that's made in single units. This is a big production thing with a whole industry behind it. So that's an iPhone 7. So what you've seen so far are very much flagship devices, the Note 8, the iPhone 10, and so on. But the counterfeiters counterfeit everything. There's a whole spectrum of devices. And even the nature of what you would call a counterfeit is kind of nuanced. So here is a counterfeit Nokia 3310, except technically you could say that this isn't actually a counterfeit because it doesn't say Nokia on it. But it's using the Nokia trade dress, so it's designed to deceive at some level. So counterfeiters will counterfeit anything. And finally, I will show you another device that isn't actually fake at all, but nonetheless is on the market. This is a €10 card phone, widely available online. It's not pretending to be anything, yet it's not a sanctioned device. This device does not have a GSMA-issued tag, but it's for sale online and it works just perfectly. So that's a quick tour of the devices that we see on the marketplace today. So I'm going to flip back to the presentation and go into more details on what we actually, on the details of these devices. So just to recap a little bit, we've all heard about fake watches and fake handbags and fake jewelry and so on, but many of us think that the counterfeit phone thing is kind of a faraway problem you don't need to worry about. So people ask us, how big of a problem is this actually? The EU Intellectual Property Organization did a study on this in 2017 and found that it is a $45 billion euro problem worldwide in 2015. This represents 13% of legitimate sales. In other words, the genuine manufacturers potentially lost this amount of money through the sale of counterfeit devices. In the EU alone, the numbers are 4 billion euro and 8% of legitimate sales. If you're curious about the actual number of devices that are sold each year, the EU IPO estimates that it's 180 million devices. That report is available for free on their website if anybody wants to get it. We will link that from our own website too. But still, people have this kind of sense that this is something I don't need to worry about. It's far away, it's in poor places, no problem. But we keep an eye on this. These are a selection of headlines just from the last 6 months or so that very much show that this is a problem in everybody's backyard. This is a global problem. It's not a faraway problem. This affects all of us in our own territories. It's a problem everywhere. So many of you will not have seen any of these devices in the shops. So where are people getting them? How much do they cost? First thing, price. They're typically sold at about 10 times less than the real equivalents. The iPhone 10 you saw cost me 80 euros, and it is perfect. So 10 times less than the real equivalents. They're sold unlocked, so they're ready to go on any network. The channels that they're purchased through take 3 forms. There's the standard e-commerce flow, we buy them on a website, but they're also sold in marketplaces on established e-commerce platforms. So we all use Amazon and so on. Amazon, Flipkart, and AliExpress all support the concept of a marketplace where a merchant can set themselves up on the bigger platform, use the brand, leverage the brand, and sell goods on there. So marketplaces on big e-commerce platforms are another channel through which people get these. The merchant can sell a few thousand, shut down, they're gone. And finally, there's local classified ad services. This means the equivalent of Craigslist, Gumtree, even eBay, and this works for people who aren't familiar with buying things online. So these devices are widely available through these channels. So we're going to take a look at a particular one e-commerce experience. This is hard to see, but we're going to zoom in. This is an e-commerce vendor that sells real goods and counterfeit goods side by side. And here is their listing of counterfeit devices on offer. Right at the top of the list, you'll see the iPhone XS Max, the flagship Apple device. So if we pretend to have clicked on that device, this is the page that comes up. This is the details of this device that's been offered for sale. And there are a few things worth calling out here. First of all, this vendor is openly admitting that this phone is fake. In the title of the page, they're saying this is a 3G phone pretending to be a 4G phone. They're also saying that the storage capacity mentioned by the device is fake. It is pretending to be a 256 gigabyte device. It's not. In reality, it's probably 16 or 32. So that's one interesting point. Second point, the price, as we mentioned, this device is normally 1,200 euros or thereabouts unlocked. Here it's been sold for between $80 and $100. Quite the bargain. Next is this vendor has set themselves up to support a single purchase or bulk purchase. You can buy one of these devices or 50, they don't care. They're set up to deliver, and if you think about it, this suits the local marketplaces concept really well. They can buy 50, sell them locally, and vanish. Finally, free shipping worldwide via DHL. And if you think about it, this takes away much of the perceived risk. Yes, this is a faraway vendor, probably running in China or somewhere, but hey, they're using DHL. This takes away much of the perceived risk. So in summary, this is a first-class retail experience. This is not hard. The devices are cheap. They come quickly in about 6 days or so, and they're cheap. Easy to get, cheap, and effective. When we started this project a few years ago, we thought that the counterfeiters would limit themselves to high-end devices because you'll make the most money there, right? It turns out not to be the case. The counterfeiters will counterfeit anything. The Nokia 3310 that you see there, it was announced at NWC here in 2 years ago, and it was available within weeks in the online marketplaces. And even though this device was cheap, it was 50 euros, the counterfeit was even cheaper again. It was 15 euros, even though it included extra features. So cheap devices will be counterfeit as well. It's also worth noting that the counterfeits, they're not limited to Nokia, to Samsung and Apple. We've seen Nokia, Motorola, many Chinese brands, so every brand is counterfeited. And even within the brands, if you take Samsung, it's not just the Note 8s and the Note 10s and so on. The J7 device here is available in counterfeit form. The A range of devices are available in counterfeit form. So the main point to take away here is if something sells, it will be copied. It doesn't matter how much it costs. So I'm going to hand back to John now briefly to talk about market impacts.
Thank you, Ron. So many of you will be aware in your respective industries of the different potential impacts, but I'll run through some of those here. First of all, the consumer or the subscriber. The first obvious problem is they're being defrauded. Now, what proportion of them are knowingly purchasing a counterfeit device is hard to know. Some proportion will know, but some won't. The second aspect, there's a safety hazard. The batteries of these devices are very suspect. And we've actually examined some of the chargers, and no electrical regulator would pass them. They are positively dangerous. There are privacy risks, and we'll come to talking about this more, but any data on a counterfeit phone or a non-standard phone is potentially at risk. You cannot be sure it stays there. And finally, there are further fraud aspects because these devices are a conduit for malware injection, which we'll talk about subsequently. But finally, coming back to a more mundane aspect, if the compass is missing, the consumer may simply get lost. The mobile operator. A symptom of non-standard and counterfeit devices on the network is duplicate IMEIs. The proportion of these will vary worldwide, but the effect of this, and there's also different causes for duplicate IMEIs, which we'll go into a little later. But the overall effect of this is reduced data and network integrity. You have it reduces your knowledge of what's really going on the network. Other effects are things like impacts on cell capacity. Because the devices are assembled at low cost with less respect perhaps for tolerances, things like the antenna completion, the antenna assembly may be poor, and this results in all kinds of problems at the frequency level. And finally, the power management is poor. You get, because the devices are lower specification, the network cell towers are forced to transmit at a higher power to reduce things like dropped calls, etc. The device OEMs or brands themselves, revenue loss, we've already mentioned. It's hard to know for sure how much revenue loss really occurs, because if somebody's in the market for a $50 counterfeit device, then they may not be in the market for a $500 device. And again, this is hard to measure. But another aspect, which is probably more important overall, is really the brand impact or reputational damage. Because somebody who buys a fake phone without knowing it, they will have a poor experience. They will talk about it to family and friends, and possibly more widely. They may say on social media, "I'm never buying this brand again." This impact is impossible to measure, but it builds over time. It's very damaging. Another area, enterprises, corporations, businesses. Depending on the sector you're in, if you're in the mobile phone ecosystem, you will be being affected by this at some level. So cybersecurity, if you're in the enterprise, these devices are a risk. And you could be also facing potentially direct revenue loss. Imagine if you're in the insurance business and you're paying to replace screens at a $200 rate on a $50 device. The environment itself. We are talking about fairly serious hazardous substances. The restriction on hazardous substances directive, which came out in the last century, in effect, it can be assumed that this is not being complied with. And in effect, these devices simply have a larger carbon footprint at multiple levels. Government. Citizens are being defrauded. You have excise revenue losses due to under-the-table shipments, in effect. Ronan mentioned that DHL and other reputable shippers are used. When we receive packages in our offices in Dublin, they come in marked as $40 MP4 players, for example. So these devices come in under the radar. The packages are not opened by customs if they stay under the radar. So this is a revenue loss aspect. And finally, there's governments could be exposed to a breach of trade agreements. Many countries may be signed up to trade agreements which require proactive exercise or initiatives to control and manage counterfeit devices. And finally, you could be a simple app developer. Imagine if you develop a new game, which is very demanding on device resources, and it rolls out and you get lots of reviews saying, this app doesn't work, this app doesn't run, it runs really slowly, deleting, 1 star. Imagine if those reviews were simply because people were running your app on a non-standard or a fake phone. So with that, I'll hand back to Ronan to talk more about the nature of the devices.
Thank you, John. So we've learned about the impact. We're going to talk a bit more about the actual characteristics of these devices. What are they like? What's inside? So as we saw on the camera, physically, these devices are perfect because the counterfeiters have to ensure that the sale actually happens. They have to ensure that the consumer accepts the package and believes they bought a correct, authentic phone. So the packaging is perfect. The physical aspects of the device are perfect. The screens look really good. The accessories are present and functional. And basically, they're indistinguishable from the genuine item. So physically, the devices are perfect. But clearly, if these are being sold for 10 times less than the real devices, they have to make up those costs somewhere. So let's have a look inside. This is a typical smartphone with all the components laid out. So the counterfeiters make gains in a few different areas. The first one is the system on a chip. The system on a chip in a modern smartphone is essentially as many pieces of the phone that you can fit into a single piece of silicon. It's the core of the phone. So they make significant gains here by using a many years old SoC. In effect, you're getting a 2015 era phone wrapped up in a 2019 era body. So there's a big saving to be made there. Secondly, the screens. The screens superficially look really good, but in fact, they're about 4 times less resolution than the authentic ones. The cameras. Smartphones have at least 2 cameras these days. Cameras are expensive. The user won't notice initially, so the cameras tend to be much less good than the real counterparts. Previous generation connectivity. You saw in the e-commerce screenshot, typically the devices will be at least 1 generation behind the authentic. So if they claim to be 4G, they'll in fact be 3G. The same goes for the Wi-Fi. Antenna design. John mentioned the antennas aren't designed well, so they listen poorly and transmit weakly. The batteries tend to be poor quality. This fingerprint sensor is completely fake. Any touch will unlock it. And finally, there are components that are entirely missing. You saw the compass on the iPhone clone was completely faked. That's because the magnetometer is just missing. So you can save significant money there. So on the hardware side, you're getting less than you expected, but on the software side, you're getting more. So first of all, these devices use a really heavily customized version of Android. It's typically Android 4-point-something, years old, but they masquerade as the latest version and deliberately misreport key characteristics of the device. But more importantly, pre-installed malware is routine. We have purchased many of these devices over the last few years, and very, very often there is pre-installed, unremovable malware on board. So on the software side, you're getting more than you bargained for. So this brings up the broader topic of security concerns, and this is big enough that we want to dive into it a little bit more. So I mentioned malware. These devices tend to have pre-installed, unremovable malware, and this malware runs the gamut from invasive adware at one end, so this means ads that pop up no matter what you're doing, all the way up to keyloggers that track every single keystroke you enter, DDoS hosts, crypto locker viruses. Every type of malware you can imagine is pre-installed in these devices. And quite sinisterly, in many cases, the activation is delayed. So you saw this iPhone 7 I showed you before. We purchased this a couple of years ago, hooked it up to the charger, and put it on a shelf in our lab. 2 weeks later, our network guy came running into the engineering department and said, "What the hell are you guys up to now?" This device had reached out to a command and control center, downloaded its instructions, and tried to infect our network drives with the CryptoWall virus. So we hadn't touched it, we just plugged it in, turned it on, left it. It waited 2 weeks before activation. And we've heard reports of activations of as long as a year after the purchase. It's pretty sinister stuff. So malware is part of the business model. The counterfeiters use the malware to increase their margins. It's paid placement. Second aspect of security is native apps. Many of us use our smartphones more for apps than even phone calls. But here's the thing, the counterfeit devices are not a safe platform for apps. Everything that an app relies on in a counterfeit operating system cannot be assumed to be safe. So user authentication details will leak, requests to your own back-end platforms can be intercepted, so these are not safe for running any apps on. Another interesting aspect of the whole app side of things is these devices have an entire parallel ecosystem of apps. You saw the iPhone I just showed you. It's running Android, yet the screenshot on the left there shows you there's an app store that looks like the Apple App Store running on this device, full of all of the apps that you'd expect to be there, but who knows where these apps come from or what they are. They typically will work. I mean, the Skype will do Skype stuff and WhatsApp will function as WhatsApp does, but you don't know what else they're doing. Are they capturing your authentication details? Probably. So the provenance of these apps in the parallel app store is completely unknown. And this hurts the app vendors as well. The other aspect in the screenshot on the right is these devices come with pre-installed apps. You see I've circled WhatsApp. The Apple Health app came on this Android device. Facebook was pre-installed, and you have no idea what these apps are. They work, but who knows what they're doing. So suspect apps are routine. Finally, on the security side, there's the more direct impact on user security. The fingerprint sensors are fake. They go through the whole motion of registering the fingerprint and displaying the little cute animation, but after that, any fingerprint or any touch of skin will unlock them. So the user thinks they're protected, but they're not. The Face ID implementation is easily fooled, and they're using ancient Android versions that haven't been patched and get no updates. So there's direct impacts to the user security also. So taking all these things together, the parallel App Store ecosystem, the direct threats to user security, pre-installed apps, counterfeit devices must be considered a hostile platform. They're not safe for anybody. And it's not just the consumer, the unwitting consumer that is impacted by this. Everything this device touches is impacted. If you're on a Wi-Fi network, you can affect everybody. In a corporate LAN, on a cellular network, everybody is impacted by these devices. The harm extends to everyone. So what can we do? We have a solution for this, and in order to think about the solution, you have to consider what a smartphone is. A smartphone is basically made of 3 distinct layers of functionality. At the bottom, you have the hardware. This is the CPU, the GPU, the cellular radio, all on the bottom layer. On top of that layer, you have the operating system that provides services, and on top of that, again, you have the apps that people interact with, the dialer, the browser, and so on. But each layer of the smartphone makes claims of identity. At the hardware layer, you've got the things that we're familiar with, the TAC address, the IMEI, the MAC, the Bluetooth address, so there are claims of identity there. But the operating system also makes claims of identity. It will say, I am a Samsung SGH 9600. So a claim is made there as well. And finally, at the top layer in the apps, there are claims of identity too. So the device is identifying itself in multiple ways at each layer. So what we do is we combine that with the fact that a smartphone is a really rich, connected computer. We can examine all of its components quickly, silently, and without impacting user privacy. Whether or not a device is counterfeit does not depend on user data. So we do a deep hardware inspection, gather as many things as we can, and send it to ourselves for analysis. So the solution takes the following form. If you imagine a smartphone, and on that smartphone, you have an app running or a website on display. We have packaged our solution into a little library that you can embed in that app or in that website. We do a very quick but very deep hardware inspection and send the thousands upon thousands of results to our backend service, which is powered by DeviceAssure. And this has known good profiles for all available connected devices. We know what the device should be, given the claims it is claimed to be. So we send the data to ourselves for analysis. Within a second or so, we make a determination and send the result back to the app or the website. At that point, the app can surface that determination to the user, or not. It can be silent. You can decide what to do silently, and you get to act on it. The determination can also be sent to an alternate location for further analysis. So just to recap, you can take any website or app, embed a little module, a little library into it. That library can tell you whether the device you're running on is real or fake. But it turns out there's quite a lot of nuance in the determination. So I'm going to hand over to John to talk about that.
Thanks, Ronan. So as Ronan said, there are nuances here, and to be honest, we didn't anticipate them at the outset. We thought this was a more binary sort of problem. So as we got further into it, we had to develop a classification or a taxonomy in order to accurately portray what was going on. At the simplest level, authentic. It seems fairly unarguable, and yet there's depths to that which are worth thinking about. There are actually 3 sub-classifications of authentic, which I won't go into just for the moment. And at the other end of the spectrum is counterfeit. Now, counterfeit does have a legal meaning. There must be trademark infringement going on. So there is a very specific meaning, but ultimately what it means is the device is designed to deceive. So again, that's a very specific and relatively narrow case. In between, there's a whole spectrum of flavors, shall we say, which can be broken down further. We use the term non-standard to describe these as an umbrella term. Within that, though, we have non-compliant. Now, non-compliant is the term we use for devices that do not have a valid TAC. It's simply not a TAC issued by the GSMA. Otherwise, the hardware may be fine. We have the term inconsistent to identify devices which are making conflicting claims. As Ronan says, there are multiple layers of identity of a device. If there are conflicting claims, we class the device as inconsistent. From a hardware point of view, it is compliant with one of its claims, but the device should be treated as suspect because it is compromised at some level. It has been modified at some level, because true authentic devices do not have inconsistent data. And finally, indeterminate. So some devices send information that simply cannot be managed or diagnosed. So these are potentially a high risk. But there's an interesting subset of this area, which is devices for which the counterfeit is available in advance of the genuine device. So we have examples where we are looking at a high-end counterfeit, but we don't know, because the official device is not yet released, we don't have official specifications to compare it with. So we have to class it as indeterminate, but once the official specs are in Device Atlas, we can resolve the data and say, this device is counterfeit. So the interesting scenario where counterfeits are available before the genuine article creates an interesting characteristic. It's not common, but we didn't expect to see it at all. Beyond the device area, there are actually some other areas which we need to be able to manage. We see emulators out there. So by emulator, typically that's a server which is, for example, running an Android emulation. And this could be for use cases such as simply app development. But we also see them engaged in fairly sophisticated ad fraud, because you can install Android on a server, install thousands of apps, and have ads being clicked on at a very, very high rate. All sorts of fraud models occur, and we see these devices which are claiming to be maybe a mainstream mobile device, but when you interrogate it with DeviceAssure, you discover that behind it is actually an Intel-powered server. So we also see rooted devices, custom ROMs, and in the web landscape, we also see bots and proxies, and all of these have different characteristics, and we report on these. So then the question is, how do we use this information? So what are the possible use cases by different organizations? So I'll run through a couple of examples. Imagine you're a retail bank. You may be pushing your consumers, your customers, to install your banking app so that they can take advantage of your services remotely. Now imagine if your banking app is installed on a counterfeit phone. It is compromised. You can have no confidence that your users' data, with the presence of keyloggers, you're looking at impacts not just to that customer, but you're also looking at significant impacts for your own brand and potentially the actual integrity of the services. So with DeviceAssure, you can simply run a check on the device, make sure it's authentic before the user is allowed to enter any credentials. If it's not authentic, don't let the app run. Another example, in the enterprise security space, Ronan mentioned we caused a panic when we had a counterfeit device in-house. If you're responsible for enterprise security and you've got a BYOD policy, you're probably nervous most of the time. And you may have invested in an MDM or EMM capability. An interesting part of our analysis of the industry has been to discover that many security solutions are incredibly powerful. They analyze the OS, they check the patches, they check the security updates, they analyze all the apps on the device, they check the user profile, they check the user activities even. But we have found that they aren't necessarily checking whether the device itself is authentic. And this is quite a gap in the armory. But again, it's actually relatively straightforward to do. It's a simple extra check. Is the device authentic? Warranty cost control. If you are in the post-sale environment, in a network operator, for example, imagine a subscriber, they're getting dropped calls, slow downloads. They don't know who to call. They're as likely as not to call their operator. There's a cost to that with every single call. Now, if the operator help desk staff can direct the user to visit a URL or download an app which runs a check, are they dealing with an authentic device? If they're not, you have a very fast path to call closure. So you save time on calls in the event of counterfeit devices. I mentioned earlier about duplicate IMEIs and that there are multiple causes of this. Just a couple of examples. Laundered stolen devices are one source of duplicate IMEIs. If you've got a stolen device, it may have had its IMEI modified, and on some brands that's easier to do than on others. Another example is non-standard or unbranded devices, which are simply, they've never registered a TAC, but they simply use somebody else's TAC or IMEI. And finally, we see scenarios where network operator features can be unlocked just by changing the IMEI to that of a different device. So what you end up with on the mobile network is duplicate IMEIs. And some countries see many of these, some see fewer, but it's out there. It is possible to manage this simply by taking your duplicate IMEIs and examining them and saying which IMEIs match the hardware of the device it's claiming to be. It's a very simple check. If it's not an authentic device, you could have a mismatch between the IMEI and the hardware. So it gives you a way to triage your duplicate IMEIs and manage them according to how you wish to set your policy. These are just examples, and I'll talk about this at a slightly higher level. So we see the use cases falling into three general groups. So brand protection is a whole category of use cases. Another is consumer protection. The consumer is the most often defrauded, but consumer protection is really, in a way, a responsibility or duty of both organizations and even at a national level. And finally, revenue protection. Governments are affected, enterprises are affected, brands are affected. Potentially, many players in the mobile ecosystem are affected. And we actually have examples of these use cases in practice because we've been running a beta program for the past few months, and we have companies in the beta program from these kind of groups. So we have companies who are in the performance management business, device recycling management. You can imagine if you've got counterfeit phones turning up in the recycling arena, you may be overpaying for them. Enterprise security, we have companies testing this at an enterprise security level. And finally, app development. So we have a wide range of use cases who are testing and exploring this capability. And in addition, we also work closely with the MWF and the GSMA, and we track closely the workings of the ITU, since they have a significant program dedicated to anti-counterfeiting measures. With that, I'll hand back to Ronan to sum up.
Thank you, John. So what I think we've shown you is that counterfeit devices are very much here. They're getting easier to purchase and harder to spot. But there are three parallel trends that are increasing the risk. First of all, the devices are getting much better. They've gone from being barely usable a few years ago to indistinguishable in the present day. You cannot tell. Most people would use these devices for years and not know. So they're getting better. They're also getting much easier to buy. There are so many ways you can buy these. They're a click away, they're cheap, they come quickly via a trusted shipping provider. So there's no risk to buying these devices. For 80 euros, why not try it? And finally, they're dangerous. These are really, really dangerous devices. They're pretty hostile. So taking all these things together, you've got a really increased risk. So counterfeits are very much here. I think the only question you have to ask yourselves is, how will you respond? We're here to help. We have a solution. So we're going to open to questions in the last 10 minutes. While the questions are being asked, if there are any, we will just mention that our stand is in Hall 7. It's very close by NWC standards. We're just a hall away. So if you don't get time to talk to us, please come afterwards. And if anybody would like to see any of these counterfeit devices, by all means, come up to us after the questions. So with that, are there any questions from the audience? Maybe the gentleman in the front, please. Is it mic coming?
Yeah, thanks for the talk, very interesting. You touched a little bit on how easy it is to source these counterfeit devices. My question is on the destination markets. So where do these devices end up? Is it mainly emerging markets, or is it a more widespread problem?
Yeah, it's a good question, and certainly in emerging markets it is a greater problem because this is a supply and demand problem. If the disposable income is not there, people are more inclined to buy. Everybody aspires to mainstream devices, so if there's less disposable income, that increases the problem. But so it's a very valid point. Emerging markets are still the primary area. But I think, as Ronan's pointed out, there are things that are driving this to become a more mainstream problem in developed markets. And to give an example of this, last year I was explaining to my family what I do at work, and usually that is an unrewarding discussion. But last year I was saying to the family, we were working on software to identify fake phones. And my eldest son, who was 13 at the time, he said, "Oh, everybody at school has one of those." And I was shocked, because I did not expect that. But it makes sense. It's supply and demand. They've got less money. They want the latest brand device. If they can get it, they're all internet savvy. They can buy things online. So it should be assumed that although it's an emerging market problem, it's spreading.
I think the lady in the second row had a question too.
Thank you for these great insights. I was wondering, it's a little bit a different domain, but it's about the mobile phones. But considering IoT, more and more different devices connected to company networks, you have any ideas on how to create more security against, for example, device spoofing in that area?
Yeah. Yes, and this is very much part of our study because, well, the scope of Device Atlas is really all connected devices. And a few weeks ago, we started identifying fake set-top boxes emerging. So it does affect different things. A core requirement, though, of our solution, we have an app library, a library that needs to be embedded in an app. So if you can install an app on the device, we can check it, or if it can visit a web page, in other words, if it has a browser. So our solution does depend on the availability of a browser or the ability to install an app. And that doesn't apply there are many IoT devices that doesn't apply for. So we, for example, we can't check a webcam at the moment because its communications are, shall we say, proprietary. And if you can't install an agent on it, we can't measure the hardware.
Maybe it's too technical, but for example, you have this search machine, Shodan, where you can see which devices are not really secure. They collect that data. Would that be a way to go to use the same kind of data?
There could be. We are still exploring and developing. This is a new capability, and we will be extending and building over time. But I don't have a complete answer to your question at this moment.
Were there any other questions? I think I saw one over here. The gentleman in the third row, please.
Yeah, hello. Thank you. It's been very interesting. Based on what you've said, clearly these devices are dangerous. So when you're evaluating a device to determine whether or not it is counterfeit, how long does that process take as far as the testing is concerned?
It's a good question. So the deep hardware inspection happens really, really quickly. It's typically well under a second. But then there's an analysis step that has to take place off the device because it's not safe. The typical round-trip time for the whole thing is sub-second, but of course it will depend on network connectivity and latency and so on. But typically sub-second. But it's important to note that while this is happening, the website still works, the user doesn't know, or the app still works. All of this is transparent to the user. It need not get in the way.
Thank you.
Were there any other questions? There's one at the back there, the guy in the bar stool.
First of all, thank you. A couple of quick questions. How traffic intensive is this? Thank you. The communication between the device and your system, does it need high volume of data?
It's actually, sorry.
And second, just to get this question off, it's more of a philosophical question. Wouldn't that be also raising the flag that also the manufacturers are, making a huge profit, that people are looking for options? Wouldn't there be, some kind of middle ground also for consumers to have something in the middle rather than, getting to this counterfeit?
Okay. So to answer the first question, the amount of data sent is really small. It's a few kilobytes. It gets compressed, so the over-the-wire traffic is tiny. On the second question, I think you're asking, are these devices valid middle ground devices? And in our opinion, they're not good phones at any level. Number one, they're dangerous, and the attrition rate on these phones is extremely high. We've had, I think about 30% of them just fail dead for unknown reasons. So they're not good at any level. So I think they don't, there's of course a demand for a middle ground device, but these do not meet that demand in my opinion.
I think this is an example of where we could distinguish between what we would term non-standard devices and counterfeit devices. So we see the counterfeit devices are definitely a threat. But the non-standard category in the middle, you could have mid-tier manufacturers with unknown brands, and they are definitely filling a space. The problem is the consumer wants the aspirational brand, and that drives demand. So the question is completely valid. I believe there are plenty of brand manufacturers with very credible offerings. I mean, you can get fantastic phones from some major brands in China that are less known in the West. They are, I think, right in the price point you're thinking of, but there's still the supply and demand problem, aspirational devices, which leads to what you're describing.
I think we've got time for just one more question. I think there's a guy in the back. Thank you.
Don't counterfeit devices make claims that would help a company like yourselves, or rather avoid a company like this identifying them?
It's a good question. So the counterfeit devices absolutely are trying to evade detection. They misreport key characteristics. But from our point of view, in order to counterfeit, we gather thousands of properties and behaviors. It's really, really hard for a counterfeit device to get every single one of those right, given that they're running on completely different hardware. It's next to impossible to get everything right. But secondly, we have active tests. So to give you an example of what this might be, if we briefly blip the vibration motor on a phone and then check to see if that registers on the accelerometer on the same phone, you've got a kind of a round-trip test that tests both components. And it's really, really hard to fake that stuff. So yes, it's going to be an evolving game. They will actively try to evade us, but we believe there will be ample tells in any real device to overcome this. So I think we're just out of time. I would like to thank you all for your time. If you want to visit us, we're at stand K51, or if you want to come up briefly afterwards, we can show you some devices, or at the stand afterwards. So thank you for your time.